You ever have a job where just stepping into the store made your stomach turn? I clocked in at this little independent-owned grocery store. It should have been a simple gig, bagging groceries, stocking shelves, nothing too crazy. But the owner, he was something else. Mean just for the sake of being mean. Every morning, before the store even opened, he'd drag us into the back room for one of his so-called meetings. Really, it was just him barking at us over the smallest things. How we stacked a can, how we tied a bag, even the way we stood. We were all just kids or folks who needed the job, so nobody dared to talk back. He stood behind the front counter like a man in a fortress, hands folded as if those hands could command the world into the shape he wanted. Hargrove was not an old man, but his face was mapped with the careworn lines of someone who had learned to hoard little satisfactions and squander any sympathy. His temper was not loud. It was surgical. It cut sentences short and conversations into ration pieces. He complained about the weight of a box as if it were treason, about the exact number of pitted olives left in an open jar as if his life depended on inventory accuracy. Teenagers and mothers, night stalkers and morning cashiers, every one of them learned, fast, how to shape themselves small enough to fit through his perimeter without attracting blowback. One of my coworkers had learned that trick. At 19, they kept the ledger for produce and mended the broken hinge on the deli door because it was cheaper to fix it than to argue. They liked the work more than they had expected. There was a clarity to the math of tilting a crate, to knowing exactly how a head of lettuce should be trimmed. The store smelled sometimes of citrus and sometimes of stale coffee, and when the rush came the noise had a rhythm that almost made sense, like a song that had found its chorus. What they did not like was the way Hargrove slung contempt like crumbs, testing who would bend to catch it. That Thursday, Hargrove's morning meeting began like it always did. Him, center stage, giving a litany of grievances. Someone left the meat thermometer at room temp. Someone's starching the uniforms wrong. Someone's ringing up sale items like they aren't on sale. The speech had predictable peaks and predictable drowning silences where the accused tried to breathe through the punctuation. The butcher came in late that day like a rumor in boots. He was not a rumor, of course. His real name was Daniel Marlowe, and he had a broad, patient presence, the kind that made everyone else's posture settle in response. He looked like someone who knew how to hold a knife and how to hold a conversation. Steady hands, a soft laugh that didn't try too hard, and a way of moving that said he had learned the world in a place where muscle and attention mattered. He had been hired by a manager who owed him a favor, the manager's friend, it turned out, and the father of a school friend of one of the crew. People raised eyebrows at the hire. Hargrove grunted in acknowledgement and then pretended not to notice. Daniel had been warned before he walked through the market's swinging door. The manager had said, "Just so you know, Hargrove's a tyrant. People leave, people cry, people get stung. You'll see." Daniel had only smiled. He'd worked with meat all his life. The weathered bone of working with animals, with trade, made him unflappable in a way not everyone was. Hargrove would find arrogance that morning where the butcher found a floor that needed sweeping. What happened next did not explode as much as it rewired the store. Hargrove's voice climbed into the usual high, looped pitch, a list of offenses, threaded accusations with no proof. Daniel, who had a way of measuring things, interrupted. Not with a show, but like a clean hand placed on a wobbling table. "You need to calm the heck down and quit talking to people like this," Daniel said. The words fell not like a strike, but like a statement whose time had come. He was not yelling exactly. His voice was a flat steel strip, and it cut the hum of the fluorescent lights into silence. "You have short man syndrome, and it's showing. I don't have time for this nonsense. Do you do this every morning? This is my last meeting, and I'm going to cut some meat." Nobody moved. The room kept the kind of stillness people keep when they're afraid of the consequences of motion. Hargrove's face, which usually thrived on small indignations, turned a color that might have been outrage if it had not been so raw. There was the sound of air being discovered and hoarded, and then Hargrove shook himself like a dog stung by a wasp. You better shut the heck up before I make you." Hargrove spat when his voice came back, all the fury of a man who used privilege as a cudgel. "You'll be black and blue and have no butcher, and I'll go home and have a beer." It was the kind of threat that was both grotesque and absurd. People remember the exact cadence of it. Performative, as if you were reading a line rather than threatening a person. The words were a bad joke with a bruised edge, and the room forgot to breathe. The strange thing was how quickly the store rebalanced itself. Hargrove could not afford to lose a butcher. Business had a strange elasticity. The store had been bleeding undercuts and laziness for months, and the meat counter was the joint slider, the place where margins helped them breathe. Hargrove had run butchers off before, but each loss hit the register like a small hammer. So Daniel stayed. For the next 3 months, Daniel undid Hargrove the only way he knew how, by not letting the boss's little cruelties hold any power over the crew. He was practical. He was heroic in the day-to-day ways that carved a place in people's affection. If Hargrove praised a sales tactic loudly and then berated someone for not implementing it, Daniel would help quietly, showing a cashier the fastest way to slice thin prosciutto, or cover a break with an easy shrug. When Hargrove threw out a list of impossible tasks, Daniel would sweep the shop and tell nobody it had taken 3 hours. He would clean the cutting boards until the wood felt like new and pass along a joke that was a light, not a barb. One of my coworkers watched him do it. There was a simplicity to it, like the way someone who knew how to sharpen knives let a blunted blade sing again. He would embarrass Hargrove without spectacle, and the effect was like a tide smoothing rough stones. The employees loved him the way small revolutions are loved, quietly and with the warm relief of people finally allowed to breathe. For many on the crew, he became a private hero, someone to point at in stolen smiles. If life were a movie, there would be montage music here. Daniel arriving at dawn with his own box of tools, the meat counter polished, customers smiling, Hargrove grumbling, and being beneath the surface of things. In reality, it was slower. There were nights the boss mumbled threats that evaporated by morning. But it mattered that the butcher carried himself free of fear. People nudged each other and said, "That was good, what he did." They told their friends. A school friend of one of the crew could not believe his father had been so wry and brave. Daniel's pranks were part of his armor and part of his language. He had a mischievous streak that fit in the like a secret handshake. He shaved the label off one of Hargrove's favorite jars and replaced the contents with herbs, watching the owner's face as he reached in for his habitual pinch. He'd put a loud, deadpan card reading, "World's Best Tyrant" in the break room where Hargrove always kept the receipt book. He would wrap the register in butcher paper and leave a note, packaging for future customers. He did not humiliate Hargrove in a vicious way. He deflated him in small, human ways that stripped the dignity from the tantrums without humiliating the man's personhood. And of course there were moments of worry. Hargrove was unpredictable, and there were nights Daniel seemed to stand too close to the line of trouble. One evening Hargrove sneered and accused him of stealing discount steaks for his friends. The accusation was ridiculous and cruel. It landed like a jagged fist. Daniel, who had a different kind of courage than the rest of them, did not shout. He turned to the manager, pulled a receipt, and calmly demonstrated the math. Nobody saw the tremor in the butcher's mouth when Hargrove left the office that night with his head down like a man whose suit had been poorly tailored by his own small vices. People began to notice things they had not before. The bravery of a person who does the right thing while also knowing there is no medal for it. The butcher would take on a customer's regular order with a secret smile, or hold a hand to calm a frightened kid who had come to the store with a parent. Hargrove's cruelty made these acts of kindness feel larger. But the greatest danger in the market was not only Hargrove's swearing and threats. It was the pressure he could bring on the staff through his petty cruelties. People start to internalize contempt. Jokes turn sour because the same voices start to mock with the casualness of the entitled. Hargrove's slings sharpened into a freight of humiliation in corners of the store that were less visible. For some, that meant resignation. For others, it meant small rebellions. Daniel's presence allowed more of those small rebellions to be visible. One day, an early Saturday, when the light came and tilted golden and the bell above the door kept time with the morning, Hargrove misjudged the weather. He snapped at a young stalker for stacking cans, like a baby. It was petty enough to be refused as important, but Hargrove's words carry weight. The stalker, a kid named Ramon, left the station and sat on a crate with his head wobbling under embarrassment. Daniel found him there, sitting like a man carrying a headstone. "Come on," Daniel said quietly, a hand on his shoulder. "You're not made for this to last forever. You'll learn the pattern." "What pattern?" Ramon asked, voice small. "Of him being a jerk." "No," Daniel said. "Of you knowing what you're worth." It was a small, ordinary consoling line, but in the cold world of retail it sounded like a promise. One of my coworkers watched this and thought, if a hero can be a person who teaches someone their own edge, maybe the world is not completely lost. They began to see the butcher's jokes with Hargrove for what they were, a type of armor. He did not strike lashes to scar. He knocked the boss off his pedestal, because the store had been a place where petty power had begun to feel inevitable. Daniel made it not be. Of course, Hargrove's vanity wore thin. Pride is a brittle thing, and the more his staff smiled at Daniel's quiet pranks, the more his face reddened. He muttered about loyalty in a way that sounded like a man trying to rebrand selfishness. The manager took the heat sometimes, the poor middleman who hired Daniel and who had begged him to stay when Hargrove threatened a frenzy. For a while everyone kept their heads down and laughed with the butcher at the side, but the undercurrent of tension was there, silent as frost on a car window. And then the night that could have been a disaster happened. The culprit was small. A customer's complaint about a mislabeled sausage that landed on Hargrove's desk with the irritable precision of a complaint letter. Hargrove took it as an affront to him, to his authority, to the idea that someone could suggest the shop make a mistake. He grabbed the manager in the office like a man grabbing a paper by its corner and demanded answers. He demanded to know who was responsible. He wanted a head, figuratively, if not literally. Daniel, who had been cutting a brisket in the back room, heard the raised voices and stepped forward. He did the most dangerous thing he could. He placed himself between the boss and the manager without drama. He did not raise his voice. He did not lean on authority. He simply said, "There's no reason to act like this. We'll handle it." Hargrove sneered. "Handle it? You're my employee, Marlowe. You'll handle it my way. Handle it by fixing it so it never happens again," Daniel said. "And by the way, if someone's making mistakes, we make it right. Don't scream at someone like they're nothing." The words were small, but they lodged. Hargrove stormed out of the office and slammed the back door behind him. The staff looked at Daniel with a mixture of gratitude and awe. For the 3 months he had been there, he had been a kind of professional insurgent, stealing back small dignity, turning a shop into something less brittle. In the weeks that followed, word of Daniel's quiet competence spread beyond the staff lunches and the coffee cart. Customers started to notice that the meat counter was where you got decent advice, where you got a portion that fit your pocket, where the person behind the counter knew the difference between a brisket that would hang and one that would barely stand. Some of Hargrove's customers started asking for Daniel when they came in, and Hargrove, who dealt in control, did not know how to hate something that fed his bottom line. But the biggest change was more human. The staff began to stand up for each other in tiny ways. A note posted telling people to use initials on containers, a joint purchase of decent gloves, someone leaving a thermos of coffee near the register when the rush started. The change was not a revolution. It was a reallocation of attention away from petty humiliation toward competence and care. For many it felt like watching plaster crack and a new brick being set carefully into place. If there is drama, it is because humans are complicated and sometimes kind. One late afternoon, when work had been heavy and the store smelled of onions and pre-rush onions and hot coffee, the manager announced that he had scheduled a party for Daniel. It was a small thing, a cake behind the counter, a shared lunch. The staff had pitched in. People arrived a little early, cheeks warmed, hands full of small presents, a new set of carving knives, a gift card for a local hardware store. Hargrove stood at the back and watched, cross-armed, a little like a general observing a ceremony he had not permitted. Daniel laughed loud enough for his chest to shake. He was good at the laugh that asked for nothing more and gave the sense of having given himself a gift. He had a way of redistributing joy so that it landed lightly on other people's shoulders. When he cut the first slice of cake, someone cheered and the store felt briefly like a tent pitched in a safe place. What no one expected was that Hargrove would lose himself not in rage, but in a small, humiliating slip of franchise. The sound began as a complaint and turned into a revelation. Hargrove had been tightening margins in an illegal way, skimming small amounts here and there, adding fees on the register for items that were not being charged properly, moving a bit of meat weight off the scale into the boss's personal taste. It was a petty embezzlement, the kind that reads like arithmetic on the page but feels like betrayal in the ledger of people's day-to-day lives. Daniel found it by accident. A ledger slipped under a stack of invoices, an odd reconciliation that did not reconcile. He brought it quietly to the manager, then to a few trusted employees. In the same way he had once stopped Hargrove from publicly humiliating a young stalker, he now did the steady work of proof. The discovery could have been weaponized. It could have been turned into gossip and brutal public humiliation. Daniel, with a butcher's careful hand, chose a path that cut differently. Exposure, yes, but with an opportunity for correction. They did not go to the press. They did not post the numbers on social media. They took it to the one place Hargrove respected, his business. The local health inspector happened to come by that week for another routine check. The manager, whose anxiety was part professional and part fatherly, quietly presented the ledger and asked for an audit. The auditor was not dramatic. She looked at the paper, tapped numbers into a tablet, and made small sounds of calculation. The numbers did not lie. Hargrove, confronted with arithmetic, with people who had kept receipts and watched, found that his authority was riven. He tried, in one last act of theater, to deny and to cajole, to whisper threats, and then to bawl about loyalty. The shop, which had for a long time been a theater whose lead actor had drawn applause through fear, now turned its applause small and private and precise toward people who did the right day-to-day work. The consequences were not cinematic, not spectacular. Hargrove was fined and admonished for his bookkeeping and testified before a municipal panel, and the owner, who had once thought he was invincible because he could wield petty humiliation like a scepter, found himself reduced to forms and hearings. The market changed hands more slowly than a soap opera. A local cooperative finally bought the shop, a modest group of investors who promised to keep its independent soul. Daniel stayed through the transition long enough to train the replacement butcher hired by the cooperative, and then he left quietly, as if he had finished an apprenticeship and had other things to cut. The last day Daniel was there, the bell above the market door chimed for a Friday, and the morning light slanted into aisles. He wrapped a roast with practiced hands, slid a package across the counter, and looked up. Hargrove stood at his office window pressed into the pane like a man watching the last of his paintings being taken to the curb. He did not shout. For once, he did not find the tongue to conjure thunder. People remember the way Daniel walked out that day, not with the swagger of a man victorious over a tyrant, but with the slow, measured gait of someone who had put his hand on a small wrong and set it right. The crew watched him go. They applauded when he reached the door, a small, spontaneous burst of noise that meant more than the simple sound of hands meeting palms. Daniel turned back and gave a small wave, then stepped outside into the sun. The new owners painted the market a softer color and changed the staff room furniture. They installed fare schedules and made the lunch fridge a little easier to manage. People learned grammar for polite firmness, how to ask someone to stop, how to document a problem, how to act in community without needing someone to whip them into shape. The change was more like a slow accretion of little habits than a roaring tidal reconstruction. One of my coworkers kept a small thing from the time, a post-it Daniel had stuck inside a drawer, the noted joke about cuts of meat and life. It read, in his careful handwriting, "Sharp tools, soft hands." They stuck it on the inside of their locker and read it sometimes. It was advice and philosophy in a single line. Years later, when the story was told, people laughed at parts and were quiet at others. Hargrove's name became shorthand for petty cruelty in their small town. Daniel's name became shorthand for a certain kind of person who, when he entered a room, made the air itself seem safer. The story was told like a film once watched, full of close calls and quiet triumphs, of small pranks and important consequences. It was told because it mattered that someone who could have folded under cruelty instead sharpened someone else's life simply by doing his work openly and refusing to look away. The market still sold cheap coffee under a dented open sign, and sometimes, when the light hit the produce the right way, the crates looked like pieces in a still life, patient and true. People still forgot their coupons. Children still stuck their nose to the glass on meat counters. But when the morning meeting started and anyone felt a rant rising in their chest, they remembered a man with a butcher's apron who had said one short sentence and changed the tone of a room. The meeting never sounded quite the same. Thinking back, it felt less like a war and more like a long season. Small, steady acts had untraveled and then rewoven a fabric that had been frayed. The butcher hadn't been a gladiator. He was, as the note said, a man with sharp tools and soft hands, someone who could slice and sew and, quietly, keep people safe.